Joining us now is Charles Goodhart, Professor at the London School of Economics and a former Bank of England policymaker. He joins us now from Singapore. Charles Goodhart, thank you very much indeed for joining us. How big of a problem is inflation in this part of the world?
Well, it's a worry, but actually, of course, that worry is reduced by the decline in commodity prices, and in a sense it's a bit odd that all the stock markets are declining in the wake of what is undeniably good news for the world.
Absolutely. Who said markets had any rationality, though, Charles Goodhart? We've got, of course, a big run-up. That could be the reason why we're seeing them on the way down. But this could just be a blip when it comes to declining commodity prices. And, you know, historically, they're still very high, and something has to be done to address it.
Absolutely. And I think that the volatility in commodity prices is going to remain extremely high. But energy prices in particular have been raised by political fears, and if the political fears decline, then I think it's quite possible that energy prices might go down with them. My greater concern actually is basic food prices, particularly grains, where the world inventory reserves of grain after last year's poor harvests were much reduced, and grain prices are going to be very volatile ahead of this coming Northern Hemisphere harvest.
Yeah, we'll be looking at that, monitoring that as ever as well. But I just want to talk to you and get your view about China as well. We're expecting another rate hike coming from there. How do you rate the way the People's Bank of China has actually dealt with inflation in its economy and its monetary policy itself with the variety of tools that it's been using?
Well, you talk about the People's Bank of China, and monetary policy is actually largely run by the State Council. It's a much more politicized policy than it is in Western countries where central banks have greater independence. I think that the People's Bank of China, given their preferences, would actually have allowed a faster rise in the managed exchange rate and probably a greater rise in interest rates, rather than this rather curious policy of trying to increase reserve requirements, which simply acts as a small tax on banks' credit expansion.
Let's move now to Europe, and inflation in Europe, is that a secondary issue when you look at what's happening with the debt crisis? And with that in mind, where are we in the time frame that these countries have to sort out their deficits?
The debt crisis continues, and in many ways it actually gets worse. The expected rate of growth in the peripheral countries most at risk continues to be very low and negative, and under those circumstances tax revenues are sluggish and the deficit reduction is lower than people might like. The debt crisis continues. The various measures that have been taken have been effectively not much more than liquidity palliatives, to use the common jargon phrase, kicking the can down the road rather than actually resolving the issue. And the markets are, in this respect, I think, are much nearer right than the rather hopeful comments that you get from the authorities.
Right. Well, people mention Spain and Italy as being the next shoe to drop. Do you buy into that, or do you think that these are countries which are dealing with things satisfactorily?
Well, they are. In fact, Italy, among all countries, has done most to keep its deficit very low throughout this particular period. Of all the European countries, Italy has had almost the lowest deficits, and its debt ratio is not increasing at the rate that others are. And Spain has taken some really quite major steps towards bringing about a reduction in its deficit. and it has managed to maintain social and political cohesion despite having had very high unemployment rates now for several years. So that in many ways Spain has done a considerable, you might almost describe it as a remarkable job in trying to deal with the pressures that it's under. That doesn't mean to say that it's overcome the pressures, but it has certainly done a great deal to try and meet those pressures.
Charles Goodhart, thank you very much indeed for joining us.